Welcome to the Fac Dev Lounge, the faculty development podcast for Dalhousie Medicine, New Brunswick, and I'm Dr. Sarah Gander, your host for our podcast today. Today I welcome Patti Doyle-Bedwell, faculty at Dalhousie University, and Mi'kmaq woman, lawyer, and writer. You may have seen her in the media advocating for Indigenous women's rights, and she wrote her thesis on compensation for residential school survivors, well before the recent events have emerged more publicly for us all to finally see. We discuss the recent discovery of the bodies buried at the sites of residential schools and how we as faculty can observe the calls to action of the TRC. Please also check out the show notes for some important links and resources. Welcome, Patti. Hello and welcome to the Fac Dev Lounge podcast. Today I'm very happy to welcome Patti Doyle-Bedwell, who's a Mi'kmaq woman, lawyer, and writer and faculty at Dalhousie University in Halifax. In particular today, I'm excited to have her, but also have a conversation about some very timely topics here in Canada about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for our Indigenous populations, First Nation, Inuit and Métis populations in Canada, but also to discuss our ever-present land acknowledgement and territory acknowledgement, which is a very important piece of our introductions. But I would love to have Patti's input on this as we move forward and some direction. So welcome, Patti.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
We've overcome some technological difficulties.
Yes.
So Patti and I are having this conversation for the second or third time now.
Yes.
But I just wanted to welcome you and say thank you for your time and an extension of my sincere apologies and devastation for the recent news of the discovery of children at residential schools here in Canada.
Thank you.
So maybe we'll start there with, maybe opening up the discussion about how this was not news to Indigenous people in Canada. This was a confirmation of what was long since known in your community.
Yes, and that was when the Kamloops story broke in May, the end of May. One of the questions I asked, we have an Indigenous Advisory Council at Dal, and we're certainly grieving what we're learning. There's no question about that. But we did know about these stories before, and now it's reached the wider public consciousness. But there have been stories within our communities for years. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal People did a report on residential schools and spoke to many, many, many survivors in their travels across Canada. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, of course, that was based on residential schools, and released their report in 2015. And they had found evidence of probably 4,000 to 5,000 kids that were lost or had died in the schools. And one of the names that have been brought forward is Dr. Peter Bryce. He was a physician in early 1900s. He did a report on the residential schools. He was a physician for the federal government, worked for them. And after his assessment, he decided that it would be the best thing for the federal government to be charged with manslaughter, because so many kids had died and they weren't getting proper medical attention. They weren't getting proper nutrition. The schools were taking kids that had infectious diseases. And so even though the federal government had told the schools not to take kids with disease, they were taking the kids and it was spreading through the schools. So Dr. Peter Bryce said Canada should be charged with manslaughter. So all of this information was out there percolating. And we do know, with residential schools, that they were set up to get rid of the Indian problem. Like, it was very clear. They said, we will continue until there is not a single Indian left in the body politic. And they had set it up on purpose to get rid of this Indian problem. And they had started that process with setting up of reserves and putting all Indigenous peoples on reserves and separating them from the mainstream community until they could learn to be, as they quoted in their reports, good white people, Christian, debt-free, non-drinker, non-gambler, non-adulterer, non-whatever. And they found that trying to remove adults from their culture and traditions wasn't working. Like, we as Indigenous people were still holding on to our spirituality, our culture, language, and traditions. So the government thought the best thing to do then was to forget about the grown-ups and go with the kids. And the best way to do that would be to remove them from their home and their community. So to get that culture, our culture and tradition and languages out of them. And so, of course, in the schools, they weren't allowed to even speak their own Indigenous language. They weren't allowed to go home. So it was very much planned and set up for that purpose. So it's been an ongoing, I think I would say it's been an ongoing discovery and learning process, I think, for public, for the greater public in Canada about what's happened. They weren't just like, I had a friend of mine who lived in Shuby, and he said to me, a non-native guy, and he goes, "Oh, well, the Shuby Residential School was an Indian college." It's like, no, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. No, and just as a personal note, I've been listening to these stories since I was a kid. My mom was a residential school survivor, and my aunties and uncles were also residential school survivors. So I've known about this since I was a little kid.
Well, as a pediatrician myself, well, and as a mom and as a human being, the level of nauseating, feelings that come from hearing about residential schools and what has happened, plus with the feelings of not ever having been taught that in our own curriculum and understanding it, just creates this place of, shock and disbelief that this is our Canada. We thought that, this was a place where people could be free and
That's right.
welcome. And don't get me wrong. I mean, I think I wasn't completely ignorant to a lot of the things going on, and particularly with my role as a pediatrician and as a social pediatrician with advocating for child's rights. If you're not paying attention to our Indigenous children, then
Right.
you're not paying attention, because
That's right.
the rights
And there's
are
a lot of issues. Yes.
there are a lot of issues. I think for me, when I'm teaching students or when I'm, seeing patients, trying to understand people's experience has always been a big part of that, and just listening to their stories and listening to their narrative. Do you think now this is the beginning of people starting to listen? Like we have
I
Dr.
hope so.
Bryce in the early 1900s.
Yes,
He came forward. That didn't go over well for him.
that's right. It didn't go over well for him at all. And and I'm hoping that people will listen. I really think it was that 3-year-old kid that they found at Kamloops. I know that when I've talked to people who are non-Indigenous who've talked to me about this situation, they're hurting too, right? And they have talked to me about this 3-year-old child and how they look at their own kids and can't imagine the government taking their children away and not being able to see them. And, so it really hit a nerve. And I'm hoping, it's one thing to make that connection with your heart as opposed to reading another government report that's 7 volumes long or 8 volumes long. Like, people are not going to read the whole thing, and it just kind of gets lost. But I think that people, my friends who are non-Indigenous, really connected with the fact that they have kids, and they looked at their own kids and they said, I can't imagine my children being taken away from me and then not knowing what happened to them. And I guess the other thing that I would say is there's always been a lot of different stories coming out. My husband and I went to a health research conference. There was an Aboriginal health research, do I want to say, was
like a conference
institute. Sorry,
okay.
yeah. And there was a conference in Vancouver in 2000, I think it was 2000, yes. And it was about doing health research in Indigenous communities. And my husband and I went. We were asked to go because I was doing work on the residential school at that time. So they asked me to come. So there was a person who came and gave a presentation, and he was from the medical school in Calgary. I think it was Calgary. And he gave a presentation on one of his students' MSc thesis. He was doing medicine and MSc, and he did a thesis on the medical experiments that were done on him and his cohort, which led to them all dying of brain cancer. Now, he researched it, and because he was sick, And all this
Oh.
cohort of people that he was with in the 50s were getting this particular brain cancer. And I'm not sure, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, but one of the things that they found is that they had taken the kids out of the regular residential school and put them in a house. And so there were this cohort of kids living in this really nice house. They had really nice food, they had really nice beds, they had really nice clothes, they had everything, all very nice. And then they were asked to eat, or they didn't have to be asked really, to eat sugar cubes. And they found out later that when he did the research that the teachers that were there were scientists from Nazi Germany after the war. And they were doing experiments on the kids on a simian 40 virus, which I'm not sure what that is, but they ended up getting this particular brain cancer and they all started dying. And so this particular master's student who was Cree, and he was diagnosed with this brain cancer as well. And so he decided to research it, and he did. And the thesis is out there. It didn't get a lot of attention, but one of the things that I think about with the residential schools is how we don't know what other medical experiments were performed on the kids there, because I remember we were coming back we were just totally shocked when we heard this story at this conference, and one of my friends who went to residential school, she said she was just panicking because she goes, "What did they do to us? What did they do to us? We don't even know what they did to us." So there's this whole other level of investigation, I think, that needs to happen, as well as the deaths and how they occurred, what medical experiments were done. And there was a residential school at St. Anne's in Ontario that had an electric chair in the basement. That was all investigated, and the people involved were charged. And now the federal government is fighting the residential school survivors in court because they want the police records of the investigation, because some people were charged with this electric chair thing, and the government doesn't want to give it to them. So they're fighting them in court. So it's a long, sordid history. And I think about all of those things, and I think about how many kids got sick, and I think about how many kids were experimented on, what happened to them, what were the long-term effects of that. We don't know. Like, it's all an unknown.
And how do we incorporate that into our understanding of populations when we're trying to be healthcare providers? And
Right.
part of my teaching as a pediatrician is teaching people how to take a good social and environmental history. And so how are we going to move to a place where that history is a better understanding as we learn more? And how do we take that information and incorporate it into providing the best care possible in such an individual way? I mean, I think that's one of the calls to action for the TRC is how are we providing
Yes.
healthcare in a culturally sensitive and appropriate way that meets people's needs and meets them where they are, which
Right.
which before this conversation, Patty, for me was so much focused on trauma informed care and
Yes.
cultural sensitivity and maybe those big umbrella terms, but when you speak about just you know on your differential diagnosis of brain cancer, was it that you were at this particular residential school or this facility
Right.
during this time? Like, that type of level of specificity is like what we need to move towards, I think.
I think so. And in one of the discussions we had that I've taught, with some of my friends and people who went to residential school, it's like, I think about the nutrition, and I think about, is that why we all have diabetes? Like, what happened? And I think about that. And Dr. Amy Bombay did a paper, and she's at Dow, and
Mhm.
she did a paper on genetics and how trauma is transferred through generations. So it's just genetic thing. I'm not a scientist, you can tell. Anyway, she was arguing, and this started with Holocaust survivors, actually, the damage to DNA, like the trauma that changes the DNA and it's passed on to the next
Mhm.
generation. And I read that paper and I don't know, I want to say I freaked out. I don't think that's the right phrase. I just felt this shock, I think, because like so many people in my family were residential school survivors. My mother was, and I wasn't really concerned about me. I was thinking about my son and did this get passed down to him, this trauma? And so we don't know all the impacts. And I think when you're talking about working with patients, one of the things is I think people have to start asking the question, are you a residential school survivor? Is there somebody in your family or your extended family that went to residential school? Because that could be a situation where that could lead to many different things, whether it's PTSD, addiction, mental health issues. Like those are all effects of the residential school. And I don't think people really understood how far it went. And you hear people say today, oh, that was such a long time ago. It's not a big deal. Why don't you get over it? Well, it wasn't that long ago. When I went to law
1996.
school, right. And when I went to law school in 1990, I graduated in 93. Three of my colleagues, my Mi'kmaq colleagues that I went to school with, were residential school survivors.
Mm,
They actually were, so we're not taught, like my friends, and I'm not, ancient, but, I have friends that went to residential school.
yeah.
So, and my mother went. So, I mean, it's not something that was old and in the dustbin of history. I mean, it's happening today.
And because I quote some of that research in my social pediatrics stuff with kids who've grown up with abuse and trauma, that the genetic material, it's actually that their telomeres are shorter and so they're more fragile. So when you look at like the adverse childhood experiences and
Hmm.
how not only, yes, mental health issues are increased, but like you say, diabetes, heart disease, cancers, because their DNA material is actually more fragile then you're right. Like if we start opening up that conversation, at least you understand where people, their experience and what their life has been. Like we don't screen people for adverse childhood experiences because we're not very good at doing anything about it. So ethically, it doesn't feel very good. But I think
Yeah.
if we can start to open, does that feel like we hold space for people when we say like, what's your history with residential schools? And was that an experience for you or your family? I feel like that could possibly then open a conversation that means that we understand our patients better.
I think it would help. I really do. And people are usually quite open about it. Like I'll say, my mother went to residential school. People say, I'm a residential school. How do they put it in the TRC? I'm a descendant of of a residential school survivor. So people are quite open about that. And I noticed on Facebook the other day, people are actually saying that. They're actually putting in their Facebook post that I'm a survivor or my mother was a survivor, because it's trying to get people to understand that this isn't dusty bin history. This is something that is happening right now. The only thing that I get concerned about is I'm scared that it'll be seen as like another individualized problem that means that we're in some ways as Indigenous people inadequate or not good as, or oh, your DNA is screwed out. Like I get
Oh,
really
that it gets
concerned
used
about.
against you
Yeah,
almost.
that's what I'm concerned about. And that's probably from my own personal experience, because when I did my research on the residential school, some of my colleagues were thinking, oh well, Patty has to do that because she has issues, without seeing the bigger social thing, which is like, oh, Patty's mother went to this school and she's not dealing with it, so she has to explore it, and she's, depressed or whatever kind of crap they were saying about. I mean, I'm not saying it's not true, but I mean, it was hard. But people don't see it as a bigger social issue that becomes an individualized problem. So, what is the treatment for PTSD? What is the treatment for depression? Let's look at that without. And my friend, who I went to law school with, she's a residential school survivor. She went to a psychiatrist or a psychologist or somebody, and she was talking about her experience in the residential school and saying what I had just said, that this was a plan by the government to exterminate Indigenous people, and it was all very well planned out. And the doctor, the psychologist, whoever it was, said, oh, it was a government plot. That's what you're saying. So then that becomes more evidence of some distorted thinking process instead of the history of what happened. And so a lot of people who I know who are residential school survivors have had to educate the medical professionals and the mental health professionals that they're working with somebody. And sometimes people won't say anything because they don't want to do that education work, right? Like my friend Carol, who said, oh, this isn't my distorted thinking about a government plot. This really happened to me, and this was history, and this was what happened. And so then she had to tell the guy to, read a book or something. And it becomes very difficult sometimes when I'm looking for care, then I have to educate the person who's taking care of me. Sometimes it's hard. And so I don't think people are adverse to saying that they were residential school survivors, but I think they may be adverse to trying to educate people who are trying to take care of them. And there's already a lot of distrust of Indigenous peoples, of the medical system, right? Generally speaking, because of what's happened, the stories, the racism, and the discrimination that has occurred. So in the bigger picture, I'm not saying any individual person is, I'm not trying to say like that. I'm trying to say that generally speaking, it's been very difficult for some Indigenous peoples to get care without racist overtones. And then when somebody brings up something sensitive like that, then they may not share if they're concerned that it's going to be used against them, which is a long way of saying that we don't want to be seen as individualized mental health problems that aren't capable of taking care of our children or aren't capable of taking care of the things that we need to take care of. But it needs to be recognized. So I'm always concerned about that.
Yeah. I mean,
Waistline,
there's so
don't-
many things that you said there, Patty, because for me, there's like without question, the structural racism that exists, the medical colonialism. We just had this
Yes.
reading circle with Samir Shahid Hussein, who wrote
yes.
Fighting for a Hand to Hold. So
Hand
if
to Hold,
anybody
yeah.
listening wants a heavy but important book to read, it's about the unaccompanied children being medevaced out of northern Quebec down
Right.
to the children's hospital. So these are children being flown who need to, sometimes, hundreds of kilometers away from their parents to sometimes even pass away. And the parents, so this is like happening
Yeah.
now.
Yeah, it was happening.
And
yes.
and then the struggle to try to fight to have them accompanied, and just all the political and financial and racist approaches to trying to get out of fixing that problem, in my opinion. And I think Samir says it beautifully when he just talks about how this is continued evidence that the medical system has not reconciled their really approach to separating children from their parents, which is ongoing, really, that structural racism.
Today.
Yeah.
Well, with child welfare,
Oh, yeah.
today kids are being taken away from their parents. I'm thinking about a situation where with Cindy Blackstock and the continued fight that she has against the government, and AFN is involved in that fight to provide services to kids with disabilities, and how that was not done in an equitable way, and how many kids are taken. So some people will connect the residential schools to the child welfare system, and then also prisons, because we are overrepresented in prisons. And so there's always been some level of institutionalization in our lives, when it from residential schools to like maybe foster homes and prisons. And we all, and then when I was thinking about the book, A Hand to Hold, that you get it for free at Dow Library. I mean, if you can download it from their e-library reading, so you don't even have to buy it. But I use that book in my class because I'm always looking at I'm looking at social issues that impact us and looking at the reasons why. So people like I said, they like to individualize a problem. Well, you're diabetic, so you must be overeating and you must be fat and you must be, whatever, without thinking, wow, if you're living up north, you can't get fresh fruit and vegetables. Right?
Or,
People are moving away from a
yeah.
traditional diet, right?
Well, and
So-
moving towards not what's wrong with you, but what happened to
Right.
you, to your point
Right.
about asking the right
Right.
questions.
But then, sometimes it's a place for everything, I guess. I'm not a doctor. So, like sometimes I just want to refill on my prescription. I don't want to talk about everything. But other times, like my family doctor when I first started seeing her, she was very open to my story. And now it doesn't impact and I'm not just my medical history, but, my story. Now it doesn't impact my healthcare every minute that I'm in there. Because maybe I just have a cold, or not a cold, but maybe I have bronchitis and I need antibiotics or something. But she's aware of it. And I think that's part of my ongoing relationship with my own family physician, right? Because she's been my doctor for a long time. She knows me. It's been developing over this time. So, and I think that's so very important to have that. And that's why I get concerned when we have people that don't have family physicians. So anyway, that's a whole other issue. But,
Well, and let's take that a bit further and even say, what does it mean to have family physicians, any physician, the medical system accepting more Indigenous people into
oh,
the medical
yes.
system?
Oh,
So,
my.
like, what does that mean to really go the distance with the TRC, and your care is being provided by someone who, like, dare I say, even in an Aboriginal language, if that is your language of choice, or at least has a firsthand understanding of what the community has gone through and is going through.
Yes, and that was something that, in the last, I've been at Dal forever, and I worked with the medical school as far back as 2000 about trying to get them to understand the need to have more Indigenous physicians, and that's part of my own wrecked dream of a child because I wanted to be a physician when I was younger, and I remember we were involved in this. I was 18, and there was like this group of, like if you want to be pre-med or something and you could meet real doctors and whatever. So anyway, it was amazing. And they had asked us a question. And one of the questions they asked us to determine our suitability for medicine was, and I was 18 at the time. So they asked, if you had a patient that died, what would you do? And I'm like, well, there's so many contexts to that question. I'm thinking, what happened? Like, give me the story.
Yeah.
I said, depending on the situation, I said I would probably might cry. Wrong answer. That was the wrong answer.
Yep.
And they said to us that, people who had that, it wasn't just me, there were other people in the room. And they said, if you had that kind of answer, then you weren't objective enough to go into medicine. So it was, now, granted, that was a long time ago, so I'm not blaming you, but I just know that, the barriers that are there for medicine, and TRC has said very clearly that we need to train more Indigenous healthcare professionals, Indigenous physicians, nurses, physiotherapists, social workers, lawyers. And I would love to see that. I can't, when you said, going into a physician and having them speak your language, it just was, that would be unbelievable. I would it would be amazing. So I know that there's a lot of work to do, and we get so stuck on these objective measures of, I don't even know how you could take 2 or 3 things and determine a whole person's future based on an MCAT, a grade point average, and your community service or whatever, or what you did between the time you're 18 to 20. And that's going to determine your whole career, like whether you get into medical school or whatever. My father-in-law was a doctor. And so he was a neurologist. So anytime I ran into problems at the hospital or with my doctor, we just called him and he would come in and like yell at the resident or yell at the attending or whatever, because they might treat me a certain way. Oh, you're a drug addict. No, I'm not. Like I say in my classes, there are these myths and stereotypes about Indigenous people that are endemic in society, and physicians, lawyers, professionals are not exempt from that. So there's certain judgments that might be made about a person and based on those stereotypes. And so if anybody treated me like that, I would just call my father-in-law and he'd come down and yell at them. But he's not here anymore. Unfortunately, he passed away. So I understand the difference between when I wasn't connected to that family and then after I was connected to the family. I see the difference in how I was treated. So there were just these ideas about, I think, the stereotypes, whether it's child welfare or drug addiction, alcoholism. My friend had a stroke and they thought he was drunk, and they didn't treat him right away because they just thought he was drunk. So those stereotypes and images and false ideas can drastically impact our care medically. And the TRC, even when I was working with the medical school a few years ago, I was saying the TRC, and the person who was chairing, who will remain nameless, said, And then the dean of medicine wrote a letter to our committee saying you must incorporate the truth and reconciliation calls to action. And the part of me was going, nah, 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 nah.
It took that
But
person to say it, right?
yes, but we did the Indigenous strategy document, which we're working on again. The Board of Governors and the Senate approved the calls to action and the Indigenous principles of education for the Canadian U15. So there's nothing that stops us from implementing the truth and reconciliation calls to action except will. And I'm beginning to discover money. Sometimes money can be a difficulty.
Well, people get intimidated. You mentioned earlier about, the 7-volume,
Mm-hmm.
95, like this sort of thing. And you mentioned Cindy Blackstock and her Caring
Yes.
Society. And so her Spirit Bear collection of books.
Oh,
And so we
yes.
have the calls to action that are basically in child-friendly language. And
Yes.
I just think like we print them. I tried to buy the book actually, but the new one that's the calls to action you can get as a PDF, and so we have it in the office, and it's just sort of like I share that sometimes, and I'm like, okay,
Yes.
if you need this like just simply put for you in child-friendly language, if you read those even, then I find that it just brings to light, my 8-year-old understands
Mm-hmm.
it. And my 8-year-old gets teary and says, I don't understand, Mom, why any of this would have happened. And I said,
Yes.
well, it did. And he said, well, I don't want to talk about it. I said, well, talking about it isn't optional. We talk about it so we move forward and it never happens
Yeah.
again. And us as white privileged people can be allies as we move forward and ask the hard questions and do some of that lifting when the person in the room isn't getting heard, but we can at least say we agree and we insist and that sort of thing, which I think is when we have our audience to this podcast, it's like, how are we at the table making sure that that voice is heard?
Well, I think that's one of the things that I've been really focusing on lately. Like Justin Trudeau, he cries a lot. And I don't, he can cry about residential schools. I mean, I'm not saying he shouldn't cry or that he shouldn't have this emotional response, but do something, and I think that's my thing that we've been talking about. It's like, we need allies. We need powerful voices. We need a political action so that the government, the federal government, provincial government, doesn't just, say, oh God, that's so bad, terrible, and then go on to the next thing. Because at Dalhousie, at all the universities, the need for implementing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, curriculum development, just at Dal, curriculum development, hiring of faculty, research on Indigenous issues that respect Indigenous communities. We've got our Indigenous major now that only took like 30 years. Well, actually, it took however old Dalhousie is because it was never considered important. And I'm really hoping that, what comes from these deaths, like the way we believe is that the children are speaking to us. They want to come home and they're asking us to bring them home and telling us. I don't think they're asking, I think they're telling us
Yeah.
to bring them home.
Yeah.
And I think about it as like, what do I have to help? What can I do? And when you talk about the heavy lifting, like sometimes it's a lot of heavy lifting and we need support and we need help with the political action, right? It's like, if I write a letter to the prime minister, may not get anywhere because I'm only one person. But if the Nova Scotia College of Physicians writes a letter and gets 100 doctors to sign it, or Dal Medical School writes a letter and gets 100 doctors to sign it, and professors and scientists, it might make a difference. Because they have to see the political cost, I'm talking about the politicians, of doing nothing. Because if they do nothing, it's not just going to be us as Indigenous people that are going to be hurt by it. It's going to be society, like society as a whole. Like people talk about the Canadian government and like, it was your government that did this. So what do we need to do about it? Like, I guess some people might argue whether it's my government as well. I don't know. But we are all living in, like you said earlier about Canada being a great country. and we have a great reputation, and we have, strong human rights and freedoms and the charter, but we got lost in that somehow.
Can we
Well,
take
not somehow. I think it was done on purpose. So
it
we
as an
need to,
opportunity now to step up
yes,
and to
yes,
be a global example of what it means
yes.
to own your tragedies and your mistakes? And I mean, I
Well,
say
yes,
mistakes, to be fair, deliberate actions,
or
um,
crimes.
and crimes. Yeah, right. Crimes. And don't you think we can't move forward unless we do? Or it's
Yeah,
not a
I think
truth.
we
It's
have
not
to.
truth.
We have to. We have
Yeah.
to acknowledge the truth. And like with truth and reconciliation, you can't have reconciliation without truth, right? So there has to, and then there's some people that have said, I've read on, I don't know why I read social media, but anyway, I did. And they say, it's up to the indigenous people for reconciliation. No, it's not.
Oh dear.
It's not up to us. It's up, they have to work, people have to work in concert with us. And in consultation with us. And as we say at Dell, nothing for us without us. So we have to
Right.
be there at the table and involved. But this is the responsibility of the federal government and how that trickles down, like say to Dalhousie. Dalhousie has a responsibility. We're located on Mi'kmaq. This is our unceded traditional ancestral, we still live here territory. And they have a responsibility. They can't ignore us anymore. And I think about that. I think about the words and how that has to be translated into action. Like, don't tell me why the medical school can't accept Indigenous students. Do it.
Mm-hmm.
Don't say that they didn't take 4 years of advanced physics and then tell me they need people good with people. And then they'll tell me, oh, the people that have advanced, theoretical physics degrees from MIT, they're not as good with people. They're going to go into research. Well, then how are you going to get that? Like, I just sit there confused. Just do it. We need to just do it. And whether it's like say it down, including a case study in your class, including the book A Hand to Hold in classes,
Mm.
or medical students are quite intense and motivated and smart. So they could probably read it in a couple of days before they start school.
Oh,
Don't tell them,
honestly,
you
I
better
couldn't
read
put it
this one.
down. I think I read it in
Yeah.
3 days.
Yeah.
Not, it's not an easy read, but I
No.
just, because I didn't know a lot of the Quebec politicians' names actually. So it took a
Yes.
little bit of Googling to try to really understand it.
Yes.
But that wasn't the point. The point was the bigger picture. How do we do this in a non-tokenizing way, Patty? How is it not the case report where it is the person who, I find that I've seen this happen. I mean, I've been in medicine for almost 20 years. So how is it not the case report of the Indigenous person who has diabetes, or the person of color who has the gunshot wound, or that, like, I feel like we almost promote the stigma out there. How can we act to incorporate that it's not the cliffhanger of the case? It's just they're a person. They just happen to have Indigenous ancestry or be a person of color, or, I think people recognize this, but I don't know that we do it well.
Well, I think about Indigenous people with diabetes. I mean, you can look at the statistics. There's so many of us that have it. I guess with my own experience, because I have diabetes and I've had it for 32 years. And when I went into the hospital when I was sick the first time, they didn't believe that I had diabetes. And then they accused me of lying to them. And I'm like, I don't even know what you're talking about, because I was only young. And I guess it's understanding for me the bigger picture. Like when I work with students, that's my only example. Like, I work with Indigenous students. I don't naturally assume that they have every single thing and every past trauma that I have, or that they come from the same experience as me. And so I see it as different levels. Like you have people that are, like you might have an individual who has diabetes, say like me, but then I'm part of a grander, like my family history. So if you look at my family history, everybody has diabetes in my family. You trace the disease and you look at how many people on my Mi'kmaq side of my family they all started getting type 2 diabetes at younger and younger ages. So think, oh, well, my aunt was like 70 and now I was 30. And then my other cousins are now 12 were getting type 2 diabetes. So what does that mean? What does the bigger picture look like in the community? And also understanding, at least for me, if I'm living up north, I don't have oranges. I don't have broccoli. I don't have asparagus. I don't have a gym to go work out, which are all the things they told me to do when I was first diagnosed. We should join a gym, go for a walk, eat 3 starch, 3 fruit, 3 protein at every meal or whatever, but not taking into account my own personal circumstances, as well as my family history, as well as like poverty is we did a study one year on poverty in the urban center, and we found that like the median income in Halifax Urban Center for Indigenous peoples was $10,000 a year. That's pretty sucky. And so when you look at it that way and you think, well, what can they access? We're an individual within this web of colonialism. So it's understanding the impact of colonialism. It doesn't mean that, like, maybe I have diabetes because my mother went to residential school and she ate crappy foods and then she fed us crappy foods and I got fat, or whatever kind of things happened to me. And that's the individual issue. The disease has to be treated. The condition has to be monitored. It has to be managed and all that kind of stuff. But then it's understanding the broader issues that impact my ability to be compliant. Like people say, oh, are you being compliant in your treatment or whatever? Is that the word? You know what I mean?
Well, that's the medical word that we tell people. We tell people what to do and then get mad when they don't do it. But we never, assuming that it's like some willful maleficence.
Why they can't do it?
Right. What happened to you? Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I'm thinking of my father-in-law who had diabetes for 40 years and never did one single thing that his doctors told him to do.
Is that the same father-in-law who was a neurologist?
Mm-hmm. He said to me one day, I was at his office. We were at his office doing something. I don't know, we were cleaning or filing or something. And I was testing my blood sugar and I had my poker and I was poking my finger. And he looked at me and said, I don't know how you can do that. I'm like, you don't do it?
Yeah.
No, I can't stand the thought of poking myself. I'm like, yes, doctor.
Yeah.
What can I say?
We are the worst patients at times, for sure. Oh my
gosh. So he wasn't a compliant patient. But anyway, regardless of him being non-compliant and his fear of being stuck with a needle, even though he had no problem sticking other people with lots of needles, it's an understanding of the larger social web that we live in, right? So I have a great endocrinologist, right? And she, she'll give me a prescription for something and she'll say, oh, is this going to be covered? And how are you getting your medications? Are you have Blue Cross? Do you have non-insured health benefits? What do you have? And so she's advocated for me before different things, but non-insured health benefits for First Nations people. For instance, we were fighting with them to cover Tejeo, which is, you know what Tejeo is, right? It's that insulin, that long-acting insulin. They wouldn't cover it. Now, this has happened to me, and this is the difference, I think, between, like, I have a certain amount of privilege because of my job. If I go to the pharmacy and non-insured health benefits decides not to cover my drugs, I have Blue Cross. So I can get it covered or pay the, what do you call it?
Like the copay.
But there's people that don't have that. And if they go in to get Tejeo, for instance, as an example, when it's now covered, so but if you went in to get it, I know a better example, Victoza. They didn't cover it at first, and then there was this whole fight, whatever. And if I go into the drugstore and they say, FNIB's not covering it, non-insured health benefits not covering it, and I go, oh my God, I hate FNIB. Anyway, so then I just pay for it. If I'm on welfare or I'm living in poverty and I go to the pharmacy with a prescription and it's not covered and I don't have insurance, I don't get the prescription.
Right. I think there's lots of evidence that says that people will not get their prescription because they are trying to pay their heat bill, for example, or
or something,
food, for example.
And so I think that some of the most effective conversations I've had, like in terms of the diabetes stuff, was with people who had not just physicians, but nurses and teachers who asked to understand my social web situation, right? Like what's my family history? Do I have insurance? Am I covered under non-insured health benefits? Do they give me a hard time? What's going on? And then have an understanding of, not assumption. They would ask me the question, not assume that I'm unemployed, on welfare, a single parent. There was
Mm.
this great example I had when I first had my son. I was a single parent. And then I married George, and we're all happy and everything. So my son's in school in Halifax, and he was in second grade, I guess, or something. And so we get called in for parent teacher, and the teacher says, your son is so well adjusted. I'm like, whatever, what does that mean? And she said to me, well, you're a single parent. It must be difficult being on welfare, and
Oh,
And I said, no, no. At that point, I was just starting teaching at the law school. So I said, no, I was a single parent. I did have limited income, but now I'm not. I have a real job, blah, 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 whatever. And then the next year, I was very involved at the time with the Nova Scotia Advisor Council on the Status of Women, and I was in the media a lot. So I would go in for parent-teacher conference, and the teacher says to me, your son is so well adjusted. He must find it very difficult because you're in the media so much. You have a job that's so, you know, encompassing and I'm like, okay, last year I was wrong because I was a single parent on welfare. This year I'm wrong because I have a job. And there was just this, and what was common to both conversations was this patronizing,
mm.
oh, oh,
You can't win for trying.
right. So that's how it feels like living in my social web. It's like, oh, I'm a lawyer. Oh, that's bad. Oh, I'm a single parent. Oh, that's bad. Oh, I'm, whatever. So there's always these value judgments that are being placed on us without an exploration or examination of the social web that we live in. We make assumptions all the time about people.
That gestalt to punish people instead of support them and be like, oh, your
Yeah,
son's doing so well. What can I do to support you? Like, isn't
right.
that what
No,
a teacher's
just
supposed to say? Or like somebody in that position?
I have 100 million stories, but that is something that what I attribute that to is these myths and stereotypes about us, and that people make assumptions based on those myths or stereotypes. And like Mary Ellen Chappelle LaFond, who was my law professor when I was in law school, she did a report on racism in the healthcare system in BC that came out in December. And when I was teaching my class in the winter, that course, I mean, we talked about some of that report, and students were bringing up what was happening with that. There was a woman, Joyce, in Quebec, who died while the medical, I guess the nurses or doctors or whoever were making fun of her, and she was dying. And, I think one of the things that I think about is that how scared we can be to go into the doctor sometimes. So scared that it's going to start a cascade of events to child welfare to, and it's scary. And when I was a single mom and I had my son, I was scared of that. I was scared of going into the hospital and having them call child welfare. I did have child welfare called on me one time. I can't remember why, but because he was crying one day and someone decided to call. But you see the cascade. It's like, oh, it wasn't that there was a child crying in the apartment. It's just a single mother who's an Indian had a child that was crying in it. So it's this cascade of stuff. And those myths and stereotypes are really damaging. But then on the other hand, like diabetes, like it's true. Like there's more of us with diabetes than anybody, right? So and there are a lot of us that have drug and alcohol problems. There's a lot of us that live in poverty. We don't have clean drinking water, right? I mean, that's a public health issue, you
Yes.
know? So,
Well, and to speak to some sort of equitable level playing field to allow people to reach their dreams or their full potential. Like you mentioned, medical school, law school, what have you. You know, I've sat on those admissions committees where students, applicants are building schools in Haiti and this sort of thing, and then, does an Indigenous teenager have to go 300 kilometers away from home to finish high school? Reading some of the stories out of Thunder Bay and what that means for
Yes.
people. I mean, that's a lot of the stories and narrative that Tanya Talaga shares,
Yes.
and trying to understand what that adversity and what you're up against, and then be away from that culture. And I certainly would have no business having left my mother at that age, and then the support or the ability to stack
Yes.
your resume, to have the skills to have an interview. Just there's so much work to be done to try to
Yes.
provide an equitable opportunity for all of Canadians. Really, it
Well, not
extends
everybody
beyond.
is winning a gold medal at the Olympics.
Mm. Well, and to your point earlier, do they need that to be able, like, is that really what we need in Canada? Do we really need, I mean, obviously there's nothing wrong with getting a gold medal
God, no.
at
I've
the
more
Canada
power to
Games
people, right?
or
I'd
building
say
a school in
yes.
Haiti for that point.
Right.
But
That's great.
it's what do we need as Canadians, for Indigenous people of Canada, for people who, we've got a lot of work and ground to make up for, to meet people where they are and support them and not punish them.
Same with being a lawyer. I think any kind of professional. I remember when we graduated from law school, the first 5 Mi'kmaq women that graduated from law school, some of the elders were saying, well, you're awful young.
Mm.
And I was older. I mean, how old was I? 31, I think, or something, 32. But there were people that graduated with me that were younger. So there's this thing in the Mi'kmaq community that if you're younger, then like you might have gone to school, but that's not the same thing as lived experience, because our elders are seen as having that lived experience, wisdom. So if you're a doctor and you come out of medical school when you're 26, then you go on to do your residency, and then you're the grand old age of 31, then there may be people in the community that, and I'm saying even if I was an Indigenous physician and I was 30 years old, there might be people saying, you're so young, like, I don't know, like, so what I'm trying to say is that there's this trajectory. You go to get your BA, then you go to medical school, then you graduate when you're 26, and then you do your residency and whatever you're doing up for 5 to 7 years after that. So then you're the grand old age of 32 or 33. And some of the Indigenous people I've met who graduated from medical school, they're older. They're 40, they're 38, right? Because they don't do that boom, 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 boom trajectory. They might go work in the community, they might go volunteer, they might go whatever, and then they're older when they go back to school. And I find that sometimes in my past experience, and this is the same with law school, I'm not saying particularly in medical school, but older students seemed to have a harder time, they'll say, oh God, you're 42 years old, and so I think there's that what I'm trying to say is that age idea of that trajectory that I just mentioned doesn't fit with what we do in our communities, right? Like, we tend to take longer to get out of school. We tend to get involved in our communities. We tend to work, have kids, blah, 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 and then go back. And so that trajectory, it doesn't work. So it's like we got to find what is the best trajectory for us? Like, how can we get that to work when we're talking about university? I notice now that at least in undergrad, there's a lot more understanding of more flexibility.
Right.
Right. But not in the professional schools that I've seen.
Patti, I promised I'd watch the time for you.
Oh, great. Thank you. I can talk and talk. Sorry.
Well, I could talk to you forever. And Patti, this conversation is very meaningful for me.
Oh, thank you. I'm really glad to be asked. I'm very aware I'm not a doctor.
It has not, well, I would argue that not being a doctor is an advantage, particularly in this conversation, because I just very much thank you for your ability to talk to us about this today, because it's very important. And certainly we hope to be an ally in
I
moving
hope
towards a
so.
better Canada.
Write letters, go to your politicians. There's elections coming up, maybe, I say maybe, we don't know. But one of the things I just want to say about the land acknowledgement is that we always talk about the ancestral territory, the Mi'kmaq people, the unceded territory. And my friend Kathy Martin did a land acknowledgement at Senate last time in June. And she said, we're still here and our ancestors lived here and we are still living on the land of our ancestors. I went, that's exactly what we have to capture. We're still here. We haven't gone anywhere.
And our audience can stay tuned to a way to do that in
Yes.
the best possible way. And so thank you
Yes.
very much, Patti.
Oh, no problem. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for asking me.
Oh, absolutely my pleasure. And nice to finally meet you. So
Yes,
I
it's
look
nice to
forward
meet
to
you
the
too.
next conversations.
Me too. Take care.
Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye, Patti.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Fact Dev Lounge podcast. Please leave us a review on iTunes, YouTube, or SoundCloud, and even a comment on some ideas for future podcasts. Thank you very much and have a great day.